Okay, let's look at calculating consumer and producer surplus and doing the graph on it. Right? So let's say we start with a certain set of information. We told that a customer for a product, let's say a pair of shoes, has a certain willingness to pay for it up to a maximum of say $25. So there is a maximum willingness to pay $25, and the producer of this pairs of shoes also have various willingness to supply these shoes. Let's say the minimum would be $5. So the minimum willingness to supply $5. Let's assume that the equilibrium price is $10, and let's assume that the equilibrium quantity is 100 units. So now in the first instance, let's see whether we can draw up this graph to depict the situation. Right, so I move this information away and let's see if we can draw the graph. Okay, so we have quantity over here, we have price over here, and then we draw our demand curve. And we must note our maximum willingness to pay at $25. I don't know what has just happened. I'll move that. Okay, $25. Okay, here, $25. Maximum willingness to pay, $25. So this point over here, 25. And then we do the same thing for our supply curve. Now we want to talk about our minimum willingness to supply, $5. So that's this point over here, $5. Then we told that the equilibrium price P star is $10. And our equilibrium quantity is 100 units. Okay. So what we know immediately, or we should know immediately, is that this area over here is our consumer surplus. Okay, this is the difference between the maximum willingness to pay and the price actually paid multiplied by the number of shoes that the customers have bought. Right? So a customer who has a maximum willingness to pay of $20, for example, has ended up paying $10 for the shoes. So that customer is $10 better off. Another customer who, let's say, has a maximum willingness to pay of, say, $22, paid $10 for the shoes, and that customer is $12 better off. So we're adding the we're adding the consumer surplus of each individual consumer, multiplying it by the 100 pairs of shoes sold to get the total consumer surplus. And then we do the same for the producers, which would be the, generally speaking, the blue area over here, the producer surplus. Right? So let's say you have a producer who was willing to supply the shoes for $7, but they ended up selling it for $10. So that producer is $3 better off. You had another producer willing to supply the shoes at $9, but sold it at $10. That producer is $1 better off. So we add up the producer surplus for all the producers up to the 100 pairs of shoes that were sold. Right, so given that information, we can calculate our total welfare. Our total welfare being consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So let's calculate consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. So we calculate consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is going to be 0.5 because it's an area of a triangle. I've mentioned that in the lecture. The maximum willingness to pay, or the marginal benefit, minus the equilibrium price multiplied by equilibrium quantity. So 0.5, maximum willingness to pay is 25, equilibrium price is 10, and 100 units were sold. So just solve for that. 0.5 times 15 times 100, 7.5 times 100, 750. Consumer surplus is $750. Some consumers are $8 better off, other consumers are $3 better off. You add up how much better off each consumer is, and you end up with $750. So we move that to one side, and we can do the same thing for producer surplus. Producer surplus, again 0.5 because it's a triangle. You take the equilibrium price minus the minimum willingness to supply, or the marginal cost, same thing, multiplied by the equilibrium quantity. Equilibrium price $10, minimum willingness to supply $5, multiplied by 100, and you just solve for this. $250. So producer surplus is $250. Right? So essentially all we are saying is this red area over here is $750, and this blue area over here is $250. And now we can calculate total welfare, which is consumer surplus plus producer surplus, right? So society, we assume, is made up of consumers and producers, and that is why the total welfare of society will be equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So total welfare, consumer surplus plus producer surplus, $750 plus $250, $1,000. And we are done.